In today's video, we are going to be talking about components, which are a lot more powerful than people think. They can do a lot of things and they can enhance your app building capabilities and really enhance the kind of apps that you're going to be building. Okay, so we're going to be covering everything that you need to know about components and even things that you didn't know that they could do. Okay, now before we get started, as always, all the apps that I show, demonstrate, build on this channel can be viewed and or cloned by joining our amazing Patreon community. And if you're still not a member, then you can learn more and hopefully join by clicking the first link in the description below the video. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is defining what a component is. So what exactly are components? And to help you better understand it, I went ahead and built a very simple proof of concept app that will make it really easy to understand everything that you need to know about components. Okay, so on this one page here we have a sample shopping cart. Now if I run this app, this is what it looks like. Okay, so we have a standard shopping cart with some items that are taken from app state. So if I go back here, I have my app state, which contains 5 items of this custom type, which contains a product image, name, and a quantity. And as a result, we have the image, name, and the quantity. So we have 5 items, okay? Now, when you look at this page here, you should immediately notice that there's some sort of duplication happening, okay? There's some elements that are very similar, and this is this card element, right? Which is essentially being repeated, okay? So if we go over here and we go on this page, you can see that we have a list view, and this list view is essentially repeating a card X amount of times that it's being fed. So we have this shopping cart has 5 elements, and as a result, this is going to get repeated 5 times. And as soon as you see that, you need to start thinking about components, right? You need to start thinking in terms of components, because this is exactly a perfect use case for a component, okay? Anytime you have something that's repeating, something that you need to reuse, something that you need to recreate multiple times throughout your app, or maybe even multiple apps, this is a perfect scenario, a use case for a component, okay? And so on this page here, we don't have any component, but if you go to the second page, now we have this component. And so this is a definition of a component. A component essentially is a way to take a subtree, right? You have a widget tree here. And what we're doing is we're taking a part of this widget tree and we are turning into something else, right? We are taking it and creating something out of it so that we can reuse it throughout our app, okay? And so before we had something like this, and now we have a component that was created. And actually, it's really easy to do that. All you need to do is go to the part of the widget tree, the subtree that you want to turn into a component, right? So in this case, it's going to be the card. I'm going to right click and I'm going to go and click on convert to component. That is all you need to do. So when you click that, you need to give it a name, and it's also going to create variables and parameters, right? So this component here, you see how it's passing a bunch of parameters, and that's going to be done for you automatically, right? FlutterFlow will do that automatically for you because it understands that, this card here, it has a bunch of things that are being fed into it, right? And these need to be parameters that are being passed from the outside, okay? And so that's the first thing that I want you guys to understand. A component is nothing more than a way to reuse a part of your app without needing to recreate it, without needing to recode it, rebuild it, basically redo it, right? That's exactly what we're doing. So if I know this card, it's being repeated, I'm going to click here and I'm going to say convert to a component. I'm going to give it a name, and then I'm going to have a component created. So if we go to page 2 here, right? So if we go back here and we go to page 2, we have a component here. Okay, we now have a component here. Now, the second thing that I want to talk about is how do these components behave, okay? Because a component is a lot more powerful. There's a lot more to a component than simply taking a part of the subtree and kind of encapsulating it and creating into something else, right? Components have initialization, they can manage state, you can pass parameters, you can pass actions, you can do a lot of powerful things. And so let's talk about what happens when a component is created, okay? So on the second page, we have here a component, right? And so now what I can do is I'm passing a bunch of things here. And so if we select this component here, we can define all kinds of interesting things that happen on that component only, okay? And so in this case, what I want to do is I want to show you how each of these components is being initialized. Basically, I'm showing you how each of these components is being loaded. Because remember, we have this one component, but on this page where this component is being used, there are going to be 5 of these components, right? Because we have 5 items in our shopping cart from app state, right? So if you go to our app state, we have 5 items, right? Item 1, to item 5. Okay, and so what that means is that we're going to be creating 5 of these components with different parameters. Okay, and so that means that there are going to be 5 components initializing when this page loads, right? When this list view is loaded, it's going to create dynamically 5 of these components. And in order to illustrate that to you guys, I decided to, show you how this action works. Okay, now the first thing that I did was on this component, I went ahead and created a local component state variable. Okay, and so you know how we have app state, we have page state, but components can also have their own state, right? They can manage state specific to that component. Okay, and so in this case, each of these components that is going to be created is going to have this initialized. Now, by default, this is going to be a Boolean, and by default, it's going to be false. Well, because it hasn't initialized yet. Okay, and so with the help of this local state variable, we can come over here and we can show you this initialization in real time. And so I have this action that gets triggered when a component loads, right? When a component is built, okay? And so what we have here is we just say, show snack bar, and we display this initialize. We display the index of the component, right? Which component it is, because remember, we have 5 components. And then I'm also displaying this initialized. And at this point, it's going to be false, right? Because it's not initialized. And now we update component state and we set initialize to true. And then we redisplay it. So now it's going to be true, okay? And so now check this out. If I go ahead and rebuild my app, you will see each of the 5 components initializing, right? So remember, this is this first page, but which doesn't have a component. But if I go here, you can see that 0 is false, and now 0 is true. So the first component initialized, now 1 is false, and then it's going to be 1 is true, okay? So the second component initialized, it counts from 0 to 4, which is 1 to 5, right? How humans count it. And so it's going to do it for each of these components because each of these components needs to initialize because it's being displayed. It's being used in the app. Okay, so now all the components have been initialized. Okay, so that is why, we are seeing the components, but behind the scenes, we can do some initialization, right? And what do you want to use initialization for? Well, typically you want to use them for, setting state variables or doing some kind of animation or something like that. You want to do something that happens just in the beginning, right? You can do an animation where it flies in or something like that if you want, but typically you're going to be initializing state variables, okay? And so that's another thing that you need to know about components is that you can initialize them with their own state variables that is only local, right? It's locally scoped to a component. So the page does not know about it, right? So this page here, it does not know about these local state variables. And the app as well, it does not know because it's only localized, right? It's scoped. It's scoped to a component. Okay. Now, initializing a component is important, but you're going to be rather limited because once you initialize a component, the component starts to live. Essentially, it starts to display data. Maybe you're going to have animation. Maybe you're going to have something else. And so at this point, we need a way to change what the component is displaying, to have it display different things, after the user is interacting with it. And this is where we're going to be using component state, okay? Because after we've initialized the component, now the state comes into play, right? Because when you modify the state, you can get the component to display this new state, to do something else, etc., right? So if I go over here and let's say I go to the next page here, now we have our initialization here as well because we're initializing the component. But we also can modify the quantity, right? So if you recall, this quantity is on a component level, okay? And so as a result, we can change some of the parameters here, right? And we can reflect it here, okay? And so I can change it, I can click here and I can change it. And this quantity here is also going to be changed in the app state, right? So we're modifying it kind of in two places, right? We're modifying it on the component level, but because, the component is simply displaying it, right? This is still app state. We're also modifying it on the app state, right? So we're kind of working our way up, right? So if you think about our app, right? If you think about this one right here, this one here, we have a component, but the app state is above all this. It's above the page. It's kind of on this app level. And so a component is kind of like, it's down in the tree, but app state is everywhere. And so what we're doing here is we are working our way up to change the app state, right? And then we are rebuilding the component as well, right? We need to rebuild the component because we're changing things related to the component. We're changing stuff that the component is displaying, okay? So if we go back here on page 3 here, right, we have this second component. We have another component here. And if we click here, now we have an input, right? So before, we just had a read-only variables, right, that the user can look at, but they couldn't really interact with. But if you want the user to interact with, right, you want the user to change quantity, right, which is kind of what it's all about, or maybe delete this item, or maybe, do something else, you need to be able to create a way for the user to interact with your component, right? And so if we go over here, we now have this count controller, right? This is actually a built-in FlutterFlow variable. You can simply find it here. You scroll down, where exactly it's right here, this counter button. That is exactly what I'm using. And so the idea here is that this widget here has a bunch of triggers, right? So if you go over here, there's one trigger here, on count change. This is the only trigger. And what we are doing here is once we change the count, we are updating our app state, right? So here you see I'm updating app state. And then we are rebuilding the current component because the component depends on the app state, right? It's displaying app state stuff. And so we need to rebuild it. If we don't rebuild it, then yeah, we're going to modify the app state, but the component will not change, right? It will remain the same because, well, we're not telling it to rebuild, right? The thing about FlutterFlow and Flutter is that we need to be explicit, right? We need to tell the system, hey, I changed this, now rebuild the whole thing because I changed it, right? That's how it works. And that's why it's so performant, right? Because it doesn't need to figure out what it needs to rebuild. We simply tell it, and it's a lot better this way. And so we need to tell this update type. I mean, we can rebuild all pages, we can rebuild the containing page, but we don't need to go that far, right? We don't need to do that. We only need to rebuild the current component, okay? Now, if we had something on that page, right? So we had some other things here that depended on the app state, right? Maybe we had like we had something that displayed the total number of items and the total cost, the sum of the shopping cart. Yes, in that case, we would need to rebuild the containing page. But here, we only care about this component. And as a result, once we modify this, we are modifying app state. And then we're also telling, hey, rebuild this component as well. Okay. And so this is a way to, go from initialization, right? From initializing the component to actually this life cycle. We are working with it. We're changing things based on its app state. Okay, but we're not done yet. You can do a lot more things with components, and that's what I want to show you next. Okay, so now in this last page, I want to show you more things. Okay, I want to show you more things that are happening. Okay, and so here we kind of have the same thing, right? You have your various variables, you have your various quantity, the same thing. But in addition to that, we have animation. Okay, so on this component, if you drag it left, and you can drag it more, you can drag it to the right, we are tracking how far we are dragging it left or right. Okay, and we are doing that using animation and something called horizontal tracking. Okay, so as you can see, this is all done on this component, right? The page has no idea this is happening, right? The page is like, hey, it painted the component, and the component can do whatever it wants at this point, right? Provided that it's, within the bounds of the page and all that, right? And so as I'm dragging to the left, it's showing the offset here. As I'm dragging to the right, it's showing the offset. So how exactly is this done? Well, it's done in 2 steps, okay? The first thing that you need to understand is, well, we have this other component here. So I'm going to click here. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to create another component state variable. This is the offset. It's tracking the offset. The next thing we need to do is on this card or wherever you want to kind of display, track this horizontal movement. In this case, it's going to be the card, right? Because, it doesn't make sense to do it anywhere else. We need to have a bunch of action flows, right? So we need to track 2 things. We need to track an update, a drag update, right? As we're dragging, but before we release the mouse or the trackpad, whatever you're using. And so as we're dragging, we are updating component state by this delta. And this is really easy. We just take this offset, we increment or decrement by this delta. So the delta is going to be either negative if we're dragging it to the left, or positive if we are dragging it to the right. And all we need to do is increment or decrement by this delta, because this delta is either going to be negative or positive. So it works really nice. We need to rebuild the current component, right? And then we're going to have this animation, okay? And this animation, I have it defined here, right? So if we come here on action trigger, we have this animation that initial position is 0, final position is whatever the offset is. So that's why we need to update the offset, rebuild the component, and then trigger this animation, because this animation is going to go to where the last offset is, right? And so you see how the offset is being updated, and that's why we see this animation. Now, there's another action trigger here, and that is what happens when we finish the dragging, right? So at some point, you want to drag and you want to let go of whatever you're doing. And this is this horizontal drag end. And so what we want to do is we want to reset the value, and then we want to do the reverse animation, right? You see how I have this reverse animation. Now, this is obviously for demo purposes, okay? In your production app, typically, what you may want to do is you may want to see, hey, did the user drag it far, or did the user drag it a little bit? Because that's going to matter. Because if the user dragged it a lot, right, like really to the left, you may want to delete it. You may want to favorite it. You may want to do something special. Same thing towards the right. You might want to do something. Whereas if the user did it a little bit, maybe they changed their mind, doesn't really count, right? And so you want to track this offset, right? So what you typically are going to be doing here in your production apps is you may want to first check the offset before resetting it. You may want to see, is this a very small offset, so like, less than minus 100, so like minus 150, minus 120, or is it greater than 100? Which means they've dragged it to the right or they've dragged it to the left, right? And you want to take an action. You don't want to take an action if they dragged it just a little bit, right? At least that's the idea. And so you may want to have a condition, and you can do all of this very, very easily here, okay? And so that is a way to include very, very powerful animation inside of a component, but we're not done yet, okay? In my component here, I have another thing that I can do. So if I hover over the name, I can actually click on it. And so if I click on it, it tells me item tomatoes. If I click on grapes, it says item grapes. If I click on oranges, it says item oranges. And the reason we're able to do that is because I'm passing a callback to the component that will get executed with my custom action flow. Let me show you what I mean, okay? And so I have this other component here. And if we go to this page here, this component has another parameter, right? In addition to all of these parameters that we kind of covered, right? The unique key, this is optional, but highly recommended. Product image, product name, quantity. We're passing these parameters to each of the component so that the component knows what it's doing, right? It's kind of like, telling a kid their name, right? The kid is going to know their name, right? If you don't tell the name, they might not know their name. That's kind of the idea. We're telling the component what it is, right? We're saying, okay, index and list, product image, product name, quantity, and then another index and list. Well, this is not a parameter. These are parameters. And another thing we're doing is we're passing a function that will get executed later on inside the component, how we define it. So we're passing a function as a parameter, right? So instead of passing like a value, we're passing a piece of code, right? And so if I open this up, the function is simply going to show a snack bar. But because this function, it has an argument as well that we're passing, right? So if we go to this component here and we go to our definition, you see how we have this name of the function, but we also are passing an integer. Okay, that's an argument. So that this function is going to have an argument that it can look at and decide what it wants to do, right? If we remove this, then that function is not going to have access to an argument. It's not going to know, like, it's not going to have access to like additional data, right? So an argument is very helpful, right? And so now if we come over here, we are passing this thing. And because we're passing an argument, I can access this argument, right? And so for instance, I can come over here and I have this callback parameters, this ID. I can use it. It's available. Now in this case, I'm not using it, right? Because I have access to other, parameters. I have access to other data. So I'm not using it, but I can use it if I wanted to, right? And so we've defined the function and then we've passed the component. And the next thing you need to do is you need to go to your component and you need to decide what do you want to do with this function. Like we have the function, we just need to execute it, right? So in this case, I just opted for something very simple. I just, made this text widget clickable. So if I click on this, if I, click here, I have this, action flow editor. And when this is tapped, we just execute a callback, right? And so this is really easy to do. I can even delete it. I can show you, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an action and I'm going to search for callback. Okay, execute callback. And then I'm going to come here and I'm going to select the callback. And now I have my ID, right, parameter here. Okay, and so I can pass it in there. Okay, I can do something with it. Okay, and so I'm going to come to my ID and I'm going to pass this parameter. This is this index typically. Okay. And so now we are executing the function, okay? And just like how we've defined it here, right? So if we go over here, we are calling it, we can do something. We have access to that parameter. We don't have to use it. We can do something else. But if we want to use it, we have access to that parameter. And as a result, this component is like a little app, right? It manages its own state. It initializes itself. It manages its own state. It also rebuilds. It's able to update app state because it can access app state because that's accessible throughout the app. It manages its own animation, right? With this offset. And it also has code that we're passing with a parameter that it can decide what to do with that parameter, right? You can have a condition. You can say, well, if it's tomatoes, do one thing. If it's bananas, do something else. But for now, it's not doing, it's just displaying the item, right? Potatoes, oranges, etc., etc. The way to think about components is they're kind of like these self-contained apps that can do a lot. And they simplify your development because you can reuse it throughout not only this app that you're building here, but throughout all of your apps, right? Because I have the shopping cart. Maybe I'm building a grocery kind of e-commerce store. Then maybe I'm building an Amazon type e-commerce store, or something else, maybe a car checkout. I don't know, like a car buying portal or car buying app or something like that. I can reuse this component. Okay, I can do a lot of interesting things. And actually now with FlutterFlow 5.0, you can even pass widgets, right? You can even pass widgets to a component, right? So if I select this component right here and I have these, let's say I go over here and I have this component here. Well, guess what? I can pass entire widgets, okay, as well. And that means that you can pass entire widgets to a component. So you can have this one main kind of top level component that will have a sub component that's going to display it, that will be the widget that you're passing or the component that you're passing, right? So we have this comp3 here, and if I go over here, guess what? I can add a parameter and I can say something like my widget, right? And I can come over here, scroll down, and I have this widget builder. And I can also pass parameters to this widget, right? And so the idea here is that instead of just having a component, you can have this top level component that will be made up of different components that you're going to be essentially passing as widgets. Okay, so very, very powerful stuff. It helps kind of to facilitate reuse, to facilitate kind of repackaging of your app into different components that you can bring together and build a very powerful app. Because in my view, it's a lot easier to kind of package all of that as a component and then work on these components individually and then bring them all back together when you are kind of building your app. All right, guys. And so components are a lot more powerful than I think people realize, because you can do so many awesome things. And speaking of awesome things, this app right here, it took me some time to build it, because I'm always trying to build, awesome apps, proof of concept apps that are quality apps that will display exactly, display the concept to the best of my ability. Okay, and in fact, I went ahead and kind of generated these images using AI. I really hope you like these images. So I spent some time building this app so that you guys can kind of grasp the underlying concept. But also, it's not about that, right? It's not about just me building the app. You're gonna get a lot of value, and you're gonna really learn a lot by using this app, by tinkering with this app, by looking at this app from your own screen, on your own computer, on your own laptop, on your own machine. You're going to learn a lot. And really the best way to kind of get started with all of this is being able to view and or clone this app that I have in front of me, because this way I can simply transfer all my knowledge to you guys, and you can start kind of tinkering with it and messing with it, kind of learning it in the fastest way possible. And that's one of the things you'll be able to do when you join our amazing Patreon community. Because when you become a member of our incredible Patreon community, you're going to gain access to pretty much all my apps that I've developed throughout the course of having this channel. And so if you've seen an app that I built on this channel, chances are you'll be able to view and or clone it by becoming a member of our amazing Patreon community. And that's not all. When you join our amazing Patreon community, you're also going to get access to my weekly video podcast where I discuss lots of interesting no-code things, my thoughts, things that I'm working, kind of in the back end, behind the scenes stuff like that. So if you want even more content, you want me kind of to talk about things that, I'm working in the background, answering questions, stuff like that, then you're also going to get access to that as well, as part of being a member of our incredible Patreon community. And above all, you're going to be supporting this channel and supporting my work. And so if you're getting value from the content that I'm putting out, then you definitely owe it to yourself to join our amazing Patreon community. And so with all of that being said, I really, really hope to see you inside.